This is the class video for class number 5 on February 29th. Here is the opening of The Soldier's Tale. It's the Soldier's March. I'll call attention to a couple of key points and then we'll listen to it. It begins with a kind of declamatory opening phrase, which seems to be directed toward a cadence right here. In fact, this little cadence seems to stand in for the traditional 5-1 cadence. But look at actually what's going on here. In the soprano, we have a typical cadential motion directed toward a tonic E. Scale degree 2, going to scale degree 1, F sharp to E. This seems like a cadence on E. But harmonically, we arrive on a G-centered chord. And there's some kind of tension throughout this passage between G and E as tonal centers. So the arrival chord here contains both G major triads and E minor triads, and the two are juxtaposed here. The melody spans an interval within the E minor triad from E down to B, and it's the familiar Dorian tetrachord, of course. What is the larger collection here? Well, it's a diatonic collection. It's the collection with two sharps, but is the center G, in which case it would be G Lydian, or is the center E, in which case it would be E Dorian? That's somewhat ambiguous. Over here, there's a kind of modulatory shift to A major, it seems like, and again, you get this conflict between tonal centers, and then back to the more original thing with this span of the melodic fourth between E and B. Rhythmically, we get this familiar conflict between upbeats and downbeats. So in the accompaniment, it's obviously a march, it's the Soldier's March, and we alternate strong beats and weak beats in a steady, well, let's say 2/4 throughout, always strong, weak. But the melody plays around with that, so there are plenty of melodic arrivals that don't occur on strong beats. In fact, I would say in general, the melodic arrivals don't seem to be on strong beats. And so there's this conflict between the layers. There's a harmonic layer with its own rhythmic, in this case, very steady 2/4 march arrangement, and the melody, which is conflicting with the harmony, both in pitch and in rhythm. Here we have a more formal workup of the same passage. I'm showing it as exemplifying my model 3, that is a tension between, on the one hand, the EB structural fifth and the GD structural fifth. The EB fifth is elaborated melodically by this descending Dorian tetrachord. We get constant arrivals on the GD fifth, so there's a tension between the harmony and the melody oriented towards G, the melody oriented toward E. The next movement in the Soldier's Tale is this little airs. And again, there's a kind of steady march-like tempo, 4-note ostinato that we hear in every single measure. And again, it establishes 2/4 very clearly as the pattern. But of course, the actual meter of the piece, as articulated by the melody, is often shifting. There are extra eighth notes or missing eighth notes in various measures. And so there's this sense of unbalance between the very, very steady harmonic layer with its four-note ostinato clearly centered on G, and the melody where there's obviously, or there seems to be, a sense of centricity on either G or D. And I'm calling this Model 5 because the underlying tension here is between D-centered things in the melody and G-centered things in the harmony. This is Stravinsky's diatonic mode. This is purely white note music. G mixolydian, I guess you would say, G major perhaps at times. We get an F sharp. But it's not really triadic music because the harmony here lacks a third, and this is typical of Stravinsky, so it's a 027 GAD seems to be the harmonic basis of the thing. I've circled that down here. All right, here's the Royal March from the Soldier's Tale. This is rhythmically also quite interesting. It starts out with a 5/8 measure. At first you think this is the strong beat, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, but then it turns out that actually this is the strong beat, and these eighth note answers come on the weak beats. And so then you settle into a steady 2/4, strong, weak throughout, and there's a 4 beat pattern going on here. And then he throws in an additional 5/8 measure, and so the right hand eighth notes come on the strong beat here. So first you think that is strong, then you think they're weak, and then you think they're strong again. And as usual, the accompaniment, the harmonic layer, and the melody layer have a quite substantial degree of independence. So the accompaniment is mostly around B flat major, and you get various patterns. You get a 7-beat pattern, and then so you get several iterations of a 7-beat pattern, and the 7-beat pattern is all on the tonic. This is typical Stravinskyan static harmony, nothing but tonic harmony, no progression. And meanwhile, the melody is going its own way, weaving in and out of tonic harmony, often clashing with tonic harmony. Now, in terms of both melody and harmony in their relationship and rhythm, it would be very easy to infer a kind of underlying normal pattern here against which Stravinsky has composed his rather interesting music. And I've offered that over here. So this is my normalized reduction. It's quite a terrible little piece. It's a piece in which I've tried to iron out all of the things that make the Stravinsky music so wonderful and distinctive, and instead present it as a kind of normal consonant B flat major march where the rhythms are ironed out. So I offer that little reduction not as an aesthetic object in itself, but as a kind of implicit underlying model against which I imagine Stravinsky to be composing. Now we turn to the Great Chorale, comes near the end of the Soldier's Tale, and this is clearly a takeoff on a recomposition of an ironic commentary on a very famous chorale by J.S. Bach called Ein feste Burg, a mighty fortress is our God. And so I'll play three harmonizations here by J.S. Bach. And you can notice the extremely interesting and effective use of harmony and voice leading here as expressive devices. So we have two phrases. Each phrase is directed to a perfect authentic cadence at the end. The first one is in the dominant and the second one is in the tonic. The voice leading is meticulous in avoiding parallel perfect consonances, doubled leading tones, things of that nature. Very powerful, highly imaginative, inventive workings out of some very basic principles of harmonic progression and tone of voice leading. Here's the first harmonization by Bach. Perfect authentic cadence in the dominant. Perfect authentic cadence in the tonic, cut off for some reason. Second harmonization. Perfect authentic cadence in the dominant. Perfect authentic cadence in the tonic. Third harmonization. So that's the sound Stravinsky had in his mind when he set out to compose his great chorale. And on the top of this screen, you see his compositional sketch transcribed by the Stravinsky scholar Donald Trout. Let's listen to it, then I'll make a couple comments. Okay, it is strange in many ways, almost inartful, almost as like a student or an incompetent composer is trying to write in the style of Bach. I don't mean at all that Stravinsky is incompetent, doesn't know what he's doing, but what he seems to be doing is poking fun at some of the complexities and subtleties of the Bach harmonization. And there's lots of unexpected and strange things. So, the first cadence, we're in G major in this case, and the first cadence is a kind of strange cadence on the dominant D major. The second cadence, quite surprisingly, is in E major, with the familiar leading tone to tonic in the soprano. So that's Stravinsky's sketch, and here's his final version, played first by the piano. It's quite similar to the sketch, but there are a few interesting changes, and we'll talk about this more in class. But one thing I noticed right off the bat is that leading tone to tonic in E major at the end of the sketch. Stravinsky's ironed that out here. He's gotten rid of the leading tone. So as far as the sketch deviates from the tonal norm, the final version deviates even farther. And this is actually a common pattern in Stravinsky's compositional process. Very often his earlier sketches tend to be relatively tonally normal, and his final versions often deviate quite a bit. They fully Stravinskyize his underlying models. Okay, here's the great chorale as played by the orchestra. All right, we turn now to the Symphonies of Wind Instruments. Here's the opening block. This is one of the most sectionalized, blocked out compositions that Stravinsky ever wrote. So let's listen to this opening section, which many critics have taken to represent the pealing of bells. So as always, we have two separate layers, a melody layer and a harmony layer. The upper stuff seems to be centered on G. The bottom stuff seems to be centered on B flat, as though it's a 5-to-1 motion in B flat. So you get this very typical tension in Stravinsky between tonal centers that are a minor third apart, in this case between G and B flat. The melody, when it gets going, descends through a minor third, a very, very common melodic interval, F, E, D, and I want you to keep that in mind because of that basic idea, descending through a minor third, dividing the minor third with a passing note, a semitone generally on top, and even these particular notes, F, E, D, that becomes very, very important later on. One of the basic aesthetic and structural questions in talking about this piece is, given the extreme sectionalization, what holds it together? And I'm going to suggest that one of the things that holds it together are retained tones from section to section and repeated melodic motions over larger spans of time. All right, now we get a contrasting section of music. This one centered on F. This big chord seems to me to be basically a B flat major chord on the perfect fifth B flat F, elaborated by a seventh, so B flat 7, and even more significantly dissonated with that B natural here. And the fact that there's a dissonant distractor tone, a semitone above the root, is a very, very common Stravinskian harmonic gesture. So it's basically a B flat major chord with F as the principal tone in the bass, but the root is dissonated by that semitone, B natural. The melody, when it gets going, moves within the familiar tetrachord within the perfect fourth from A flat down to E flat. Within that perfect fourth, we get once again a descending minor third in the melody, in this case from A flat to F. Here's the big chord. Again, and now the melody gets going in a kind of chorale. So melodically, from A flat down to F, just as the first section went from F down to D. Now, following that, we get a very, very different kind of music. I'm calling this a little trio. One of the things that's similar is, again, we have a melody that moves through a perfect fourth, in this case from E down to B, filled in as a Dorian tetrachord. And most conspicuously, the last three notes of it are this descending minor third, in this case from D to B. Here's the end of the chorale. The opening bell music repeats. And now we get this little trio, concluding with that descending minor third from D down to B. So the music's, the three things we've heard so far, the bells, the chorale, and this little trio, are very, very different and contrasting stylistically, but they have common elements as well. All right, so here's the whole larger passage as we discussed it so far, and I'm showing this as starting out the bells motive as being model 3, where we have G things poised against B flat things. That was the beginning. Then we go to model 2, where we have A flat things against B flat things. The A flat thing is this melody, and the B flat thing is this big chord that we talked about. And then we have C things against E things when that little trio gets going. Here's the bells. Descending minor third, F, E, D. chorale up to A flat, and then F, descending minor third, bells return, little trio, ends with a descent from D to B. So if you want to think together about all these descending minor thirds, you have the minor third from F down to D. You have the minor third from A flat down to F. You have the minor third finally from D down to B. All of these minor thirds lie within a single diminished seventh chord, B, D, F, and A flat. And that's another thing that binds this section of music together. So three radically contrasting moments or blocks bound together by these shared concerns. The music continues now with another trio, and then a slightly different trio that we'll mostly talk about. This is the music I'm going to talk about. It's a flute trio. The melody here lies within a perfect fifth, which is a common structural arrangement for Stravinsky's melodies, which it fills out in diatonic fashion as a kind of G-flat major segment. Of course, within that frame, the melody just trots up and down rather aimlessly, I would say. Again, Stravinsky's melodies tend to be highly repetitive within a small melodic frame. They do not tend to be directed toward goals. After that flute trio, we get a bassoon melody that involves the three notes B, C sharp, B, C sharp, and D. So once again, we get this minor third as a locus of melodic activity. So this music is quite different from anything we've heard before, but it also is concerned with this melodic minor third. Here's the end of the flute trio. Here's the bassoon melody. And the opening music returns. Now, something interesting happens. A little bit later, the bells music returns transposed down a semitone. In Stravinsky's music in general, anytime a chunk of music is transposed, that interval of transposition is going to be significant. Do you remember that the original bells motive was on F? Now it's been transposed down a semitone to E. I asked you to bear in mind the opening bells motive, which descended from F to E to D, and now we see a large scale composing out of that motive taking place. Here's the end of the bassoon melody. Bells motive returns transposed down a semitone. The chorale ends on F in the bass. And then the bells motive gets transposed down one more step from E to D, and that completes this large-scale statement of the motive, F, E, D. The chorale then gets transposed down to end on E also, confirming that large-scale statement of that motive, F, E, D. Here's the bells motive transposed down to D. Chorale comes back ending on E, then to end on D, and that concludes the large first section of this piece, which is a piece of maximum contrast, but one that is also bound together by the large-scale statement of this F-E-D motive. All right. The Symphonies of Wind Instruments ends with an extended chorale. This was actually the first thing that Stravinsky composed for this piece. He added all the other stuff on later. This was a piece that he was invited to write in memory of Claude Debussy. So here is this extended and rather beautiful chorale, and I want you to focus as you listen on what happens in the melody and what happens in the bass. You remember that big F-E-D movement in the bass from the first part of the piece? Well, here, that movement finally gets carried all the way down to C. First here, and then, of course, definitively at the end of the movement where we descend very strongly E, D, C in the bass. At the same time, the melody is chant-like in its insistence on that D, occasionally alternating with C in that familiar stutter motive. It reaches up as far as E, but always right back to D. So it's very, very chant-like, solemn, reverential melody. At the end, however, there's a kind of liberating upward movement from B to C, this time arriving on that high D. And at the very end, we got a kind of familiar Stravinsky polychord, C major and G major combined. It's this beautiful final sonority, clearly centered on C, but not exactly a C major ending. There's still some residual tension in that final chord. All right. Stravinsky, around the same period, wrote three separate pieces that he considered to be rags. And it's actually a little mysterious to me exactly what he has in mind in terms of the ragtime tradition. So here, just as a frame of reference, this is Scott Joplin's famous Maple Leaf Rag, played via piano roll by Joplin himself. Here is a piece called Ragtime. It's a piece for 11 instruments, transcribed here for piano by the composer. I won't say too much about it, in part because I find it somewhat mysterious. I will say that one thing that seems kind of typical to me of Stravinsky is you have harmonies related by minor third or tritone. That's typical Stravinsky octatonicism, I would say. You have an ostinato that gets going here, a four-note ostinato, very typical of Stravinsky. That ostinato outlines a 0-2-5-7 tetrachord, clearly centered on B flat, but it's not really exactly B flat major either. How does this piece relate to a ragtime? In what sense is this piece a ragtime? That's something for you to think about and for us to talk about in class. Here's another piece from around the same period, titled Piano Rag Music. It's dedicated to Artur Rubinstein, not well known as a great rag artist. And here it is played by Stravinsky. I frankly don't understand this piece very well, either in its internal organization or how it relates to the rag tradition. Perhaps one of you will write about that in your papers for this week. And here we get back to the Soldier's Tale. One of the movements in that piece contains many different dances, and one of those dances is a ragtime. And here, I think we see something a little bit more typical of the way Stravinsky goes about his business. We see an example of Model 3, which contrasts B-centered things and D-centered things. You get the melody is organized around a Dorian tetrachord from F sharp up to B. There are D harmonies and there are B major or minor harmonies. All of these elements seem to me to be pretty typical of Stravinsky. Then we get to another actually rather enigmatic piece. This is a series of pieces for solo clarinet. Um, let me say a couple words about it, then we'll listen to it. I'm hearing here a lot of reference to traditional Stravinsky formulations, especially 0257, and to the tetrachord 0245, and these tend to repeat. So the music weaves its way in and out of these structural reference points. But I will say flat out that this piece, at least to me, remains quite enigmatic. I think it has to do something to do with contrast between the perfect fifth AE and the perfect fifth B F sharp. I think you see that manifested in recurring melodic span from E up to A, in recurring implication of B major harmony. But as I said, this piece strikes me as quite enigmatic. Finally, here's the closing measures of the Concertino for String Quartet. Here it is an arrangement for solo piano. There are a lot of interesting features here. Again, this strikes me as a quite enigmatic little piece. Let's listen to it, then I'll make a few comments. The melody in this section is entirely octatonic, alternating half steps and whole steps. So as I mentioned, the octatonic scale is quite prominent here in the melody beginning here, where you get, basically it rises through an octatonic scale through a couple of octaves. That's quite clear and striking. This little measure is very striking and interesting. You have a C sharp minor scale in one voice against a C major scale in the other. This is a relationship that sometimes is called the common third relationship, sometimes called the slide relationship. So these two scales, as contrasting as they are, share a note, actually several notes, but they share a common third, which is why it's sometimes called that. That's very striking. The piece, at least this section of it, seems to be, C major-ish, but the C major is constantly clouded by other things. And when we start getting into octatonic land, that sense of centricity very much dissolves.